Harold and Susan retired the same year, both with exactly $1 million saved, both planning to withdraw $40,000 a year, adjusted for inflation, and both invested in the same diversified portfolio, earning the same 7% average annual return over their first 25 years of retirement. On paper, they should have ended up in nearly identical positions. Harold ran out of money at 84. Susan died at 89 with just over $600,000 still in her account. Same starting balance, same withdrawal amount, same average return over the full 25 years. The only difference between them was the order those returns arrived in. Harold retired directly into a market downturn, losing 18% in his first year, and another 12% in his third year, before the market eventually recovered and delivered strong returns for most of the following 2 decades. Susan retired into several strong early years, watched her portfolio grow comfortably, before the market eventually gave back some of those gains later in her retirement. Averaged across the full 25 years, both portfolios earned essentially the same 7%. But because Harold was withdrawing $40,000 a year from a portfolio that had just shrunk sharply, he was forced to sell a much larger share of his remaining shares to generate that same dollar amount, permanently reducing the number of shares left to benefit from the recovery that came later. Susan, withdrawing from a portfolio that had just grown, sold a much smaller share of her total holdings to generate the same income, leaving far more invested when the eventual downturn in her own retirement arrived. This is called sequence of returns risk, and it's one of the least understood dangers in retirement planning, precisely because it's invisible in the kind of average annual return figures most retirement calculators and financial projections rely on. Two portfolios can share an identical average return over a 25-year period and produce wildly different outcomes, depending entirely on whether the worst years happen to arrive early or late in retirement. A market decline that occurs while a retiree is still working and contributing is largely harmless, even beneficial, because shares are being purchased at lower prices. The identical decline occurring after retirement, while withdrawals are being made, permanently locks in losses on the shares sold to fund that spending, regardless of how strongly the market eventually recovers. Financial researchers studying retirement withdrawal strategies have found that the specific years immediately surrounding retirement, roughly 5 years before and 5 years after, matter disproportionately more to a portfolio's ultimate survival than any other stretch of a retiree's investing lifetime, even though those years represent a small fraction of the total time the money needs to last. Someone retiring directly into a downturn, purely due to unlucky timing rather than any decision they made, faces a meaningfully higher risk of running out of money than someone retiring the exact same year with the exact same portfolio into a period of early growth instead, a difference driven entirely by circumstances outside either retiree's control. What separates retirees who survive an unlucky sequence from those who don't usually isn't a different average return. It's whether they built flexibility into their withdrawal plan before the downturn arrived. A cash reserve covering 1 to 2 years of expenses that doesn't require selling shares during a decline. A willingness to temporarily reduce withdrawals during a bad stretch rather than pulling the same fixed amount regardless of market conditions. And a retirement date that, where possible, isn't rigidly fixed to a birthday rather than to actual market conditions at the time. Susan, without ever having heard the term sequence of returns risk, happened to keep roughly 18 months of expenses in cash specifically so she'd never be forced to sell shares during a bad year, a habit she'd carried over from decades of simply disliking debt and disliking the feeling of being forced to sell anything under pressure. Harold, looking back from his final years, described his retirement timing as simply bad luck, which in a narrow sense it was. But the retirees who weather that same bad luck without running out of money aren't the ones who predicted the downturn. They're the ones who built enough flexibility into their plan that an unlucky sequence, when it inevitably arrived for one of them, didn't have the power to permanently determine the rest of their retirement. The lesson is not to predict the market. The lesson is to prepare for different possibilities. A strong retirement plan is built for uncertainty, not perfection. Markets will always have bad years. The difference is whether your financial habits are strong enough to survive them.